Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Konnichiwa, Atheists in Recovery, and welcome to episode 97 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast, where it's my job to address the spiritual and scientific belief systems of people in long-term recovery in order to deconstruct limiting thought patterns and introduce new behaviors and routines you can use. And today we are going to be speaking with Chris Blauvelt. And I enjoyed this conversation. I enjoy all my conversations, really, but I enjoy this conversation because Chris talks about belonging to a special events Catholicism. And man, can I relate to this, where him and his family would attend church really only on special occasions like Easter and Christmas. And so there really was not a relationship with God. You know, it was just something that you did because you were told to do, right? And so there was really no personal buy-in there. And so we talk about those earlier formative years, and then Chris talks also about not finding spirituality until he found sobriety and experiencing many spiritual moments. And Chris will go through at least one of those spiritual moments on the show, where he talks about his long walks from the IOP program to his home. And I mean, this was like a 5-mile walk. And I loved, what he discovered on those walks. And I think that it's really applicable to recovery on a daily basis. Actually, it's applicable to everyone, really. I mean, it's just one of those great life lessons. And so Chris, for me, highlighted the need to stay open and switch from a fixed mindset to more of a growth mindset in recovery. And I feel like that's one of the main threads of this episode. As Chris puts it, and I'm paraphrasing, the disease, the addiction, the disease is doing push-ups in the parking lot while you're inside trying to get sober. Okay, on to Chris. Chris is the Director of Admissions and Operations at Augustine Recovery. He is coming up on 10 years of sobriety this November. Chris's wife, who's also in recovery, and he have 2 wonderful children, Cece and Charlie. Surfing and spending time outside with his family are 2 of the greatest gifts of sobriety. He travels as much as he can. Quick family-friendly destinations to the beach or to the mountains. All right, guys, on to the show. Chris Blauvelt, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
So, Chris, I'm excited for you to be on. And I thought that I'd start my conversation with you like I start most conversations, and just get a little bit of a sense as to your spiritual background from childhood, and maybe, what led you to where you are today. Just give the audience just a bit of a sense of who you are.
Little snapshot. Okay.
Yeah.
Lena, thank you so much again for having me. I've really been looking forward to this. So, spiritually speaking, my background is in special event Catholicism, I like to call it, which means I was raised in the Catholic Church on Easter and Christmas Eve. I guess it's called catechism, where Tuesdays for a number of years, I went to Catholic school after public school. I got on the bus and I went to, it was called Mother of Sorrows Church and Private Catholic School in Murraysville, Pennsylvania, where I was raised. And I don't have a ton of vivid memories about that, although I don't have any bad memories. I have kind of nostalgic memories of walking through. Mother of Sorrows Private School is a very old Catholic school, and it's been renovated and updated since. But that was my introduction into spirituality, and God and the idea of a higher power was very much a novelty to me growing up. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I believed it. I'm not quite sure that I didn't. It was kind of like the Hawaiian, hula dancer on your dashboard. It was just there, and it sounded nice and it looked good. And I didn't have much beyond just the knowledge that God was there, and it wasn't really that deep for me. And as I got older, growing up in Murraysville, Pennsylvania. It's a suburb of Pittsburgh.
Mhm.
I really had no relationship with God to speak of. I had, a godmother and a godfather, and our relationship with the church was very basic, and it stayed that way until I entered into sobriety almost 10 years ago. And my relationship with sobriety began because I was court ordered time and time again into 12-step fellowships and
Hmm.
group therapy and jail and house arrest. And the last
Hmm.
time I made an attempt to get sober was on my own. And luckily, the courts had given me that seed. That seed had been planted, and I knew where to go. And I'll celebrate 10 years in November. And my journey with spirituality has been, I would say, educational, kind of a long stemming. There was no white light burning bush moment for me, but there were a lot of significant moments in my sobriety where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm coming alive, my spirit's coming alive. And some of those moments were hindsight. In the moment, I didn't realize it. And looking back on it, I was like, yeah, that was a spiritual experience.
Hmm.
And here I am today, celebrate 10 years of sobriety in November. I work at a small recovery center in St. Augustine, Florida. I found my way to St. Augustine through grandparents that I visited that retired not far from here. I visited St. Augustine every summer as a kid growing up. And in addiction, had a public teaching job in Hawaii and fell in love with surfing and the surf community. And I just never went back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After that, I've been in St. Augustine ever since.
Right. Well, I don't think there's much surfing in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Well, there's
So
not unless you're on one of the three rivers, hanging onto a rope behind a boat.
yeah, I can relate. I'm from upstate New York, so I can definitely relate.
All right.
Yeah, so I loved what you said about, growing up and having this spiritual event, Catholicism. I can relate to that very much. Just going to church on events only, and that was basically your relationship with God. You're supposed to sustain that somehow, I don't know. But it sounds like you found spirituality later on in life, and so I'm interested to learn maybe now a little bit more about your recovery journey. So wherever you want to start with that.
Okay. So I remember the very first time the offer was made to me to party. I'll just kind of like call drinking and drugging partying. Someone was like, "Hey, we've got some weed, and we're gonna smoke it after school." And I remember telling the guy, or I think he offered to drink after school, or I can't remember. I think he said, Mike and Brian smoked weed on the golf course one day, and they have some, and we're going to drink tonight. Do you want to come? And I think this was like freshman or sophomore year of high school, maybe. And the first thing I said to him was, dude, my parents would really, really be mad at me if I did that. And he was like, kind of tilted his head sideways and was like, are you serious? And I was like, okay, I'm in. I like buckled beneath the peer pressure before really any peer pressure was even applied. And the transition into like full blown addiction, I think was pretty fast after that. I went from like, drinking and drugging sporadically on Saturdays and Sundays maybe, to really, drinking every weekend and doing drugs every day, all kinds of drugs every day before, during, and after high school. I was using before, I was using during, I was drinking before. Sometimes I was drinking during the day. Sometimes my locker was like, a small black marketplace for anything I needed.
Chris, let me interrupt you just for a second. How old were you at this point?
Man, I'm always so bad at, I guess it was right before I got my license so like 15 probably. I was probably 15. Yeah. And the between the age of 15 and 18, things really just kind of took off. Like those 3 years, the experimental stage pretty much gave way to just full blown addiction pretty quickly. And I think it's because I was a kid who didn't have a lot of confidence, and I was really self-conscious. I'm a pretty tall guy, and I've always been a bit bigger, but I haven't always been as tall as I am. And sometimes I was always taller than my peers, but I was always bigger. I'm kind of tall and thinner, today, but I was always kind of like tall and bigger and a little overweight. So, I had like a flat top because I have a cowlick, and the barber who my parents took me to was like, dude, we're just shaving this kid's head into a flat top. He's got these like crazy cowlicks. We can't do anything with it. So I was kind of like, super self-conscious growing up. And I was really uncomfortable in my own skin. And you hear that a lot in people's stories in addiction. And so when I got that relief from drugs and alcohol, it was just like I was immediately drawn to feeling like that all the time.
Yeah. Okay. So you have this black market situation happening in your locker, and you're around 15, and you gave into peer pressure even before there was really peer pressure to give into. You're drinking nights and weekends. Tell us what happens next.
The first time I got arrested, I was 18 years old, and I had a car full of people, and I was using my mom's Oldsmobile Bravado, which is kind of like, I don't even think they make them anymore, but it's like a four-wheel drive. It's like, the 1990s kind of quintessential SUV. And I was like transferring people up and down this old logging road, and we were having this field party. I'm sure coming from upstate New York, I'm sure you're no stranger to outside and in the woods. And that's what we did as we were kids and growing up in Pennsylvania. And I was driving around too much and drinking, and I got pulled over. And actually, there were so many people in my car, and one of them just said, "Go, Chris." And I just punched it. And for, a few miles, I was like, engaged in a high speed pursuit, through the back country of Pennsylvania. And so they were ticked when they got to the car, and, everything in the car was obviously not supposed to be there. And I got arrested, and I got my first DUI and all the possession charges that came with it. And there was some other charge that they gave me for not pulling over immediately. And so that was my first experience with court ordered, kind of like state facilitated treatment, and AA, call it the 12-step fellowship. I lost my license for 30 days. I don't remember any of the group therapy that I participated in. I mean, I know it happened, but I was 18 years old. I knew there was a problem. It wasn't me. It was everybody else. It was the small town. The police had nothing better to do. That kind of deal. And so I just kept on that trajectory. I didn't even stop for an instant. I don't think I even I was on probation, but it was like I had to fill out these forms once a month. There were no drug tests. There were no breathalyzers. I was 18 years old, and it was my first offense. So I was really just court ordered to a bunch of like group therapy and 12-step meetings. So I continued like without a bump in the road. My parents were obviously very, very upset. And, I almost didn't make it to college because of their lack of confidence in me. But I was 18. I went to college, by the hair of my chinny chin chin, and started partying, drinking, and using even more frequently, more heavily. I managed to stay in college the whole time because I would use amphetamines like during, finals week. I wouldn't go to class. I would take midterms and I would take finals, and I just maintain like a C average, the entire time. And then when I was 21, I guess I was a sophomore, junior. I guess I can't remember, but I got my second DUI really just 2 years after I just turned 21, or either I was about to turn 21 and I got my second DUI, and I blew, I think, a .39. I damaged some property. I was completely blacked out. I damaged some property with my car. I was completely blacked out. I was by myself, and the combination of like the damaged property, and you had just gotten a DUI nearly 2 years ago, and the blood alcohol content of the event, they kind of like threw the book at me. So again, court ordered to treatment this time, outpatient treatment, no inpatient treatment yet in this point in my life. Lots of probation, house arrest, jail, more 12-step meetings. And I had to take a semester or longer. I think I had to take 1 or 2 semesters off of college. And that was the first time the recovery had a lasting effect on me, because
Yeah.
I fell into a 12-step meeting in a town nearby where I was growing up. And I knew a lot of people and in this meeting, and they were young and they were getting sober too. At this point, my friends and I had all graduated high school. We had all gone kind of our own way to college. Some people were sticking around and working. And so I wasn't keeping in touch with everyone who I knew in high school, who I started partying with. And I ran into some people in these meetings that I had been partying with. And it was the first time in my mind that I was like, okay, this could be cool. Like sobriety could be cool. And my friend Kim was picking me up. She was taking me to meetings. We're still smoking a ton of cigarettes, but it was a much more innocent type of fun where I felt like I could do this. I felt like it was attractive to me. They talk in recovery about, it's a program of attraction, not promotion. And that's what was happening. I was making coffee and I had a service commitment, and I wasn't bought into the process of sponsorship. And I only met with Al, my very, very first sponsor ever, once. And it was extremely awkward and uncomfortable for me to have a relationship with a man like that.
So Chris, as you're in this 12-step program, you have your friend picking you up. What was that like to have your friends in that 12-step meeting? And do you think that it would have been a lot different if you were to walk into a 12-step meeting and everyone was, 10, 20 years older than you?
It would have. I'm not sure that things would have been different for me down the line, because I did inevitably, without, engagement in the 12 steps and sponsorship, I did inevitably relapse down the line. But fast forward years later, I knew where to go, and I knew that it could be fun if I did it right, and if I surrounded myself with young people. So that night that I walked into the meeting and I saw these young people outside, puffing on cigarettes and having a good time and laughing, and knowing my friend Kim and having partied with her and her friends, she was a year ahead of me. I was like, I could do this, that this can be cool. Sobriety can be cool. And I'm not sure, Kim is married now and has kids, and I believe she's still in recovery. I'm not sure that, she certainly doesn't know the effect that she had, that friendship,
the
effect that it had on me at that moment. And who knows down the line, like you said, Adina, who knows, had that not happened, I don't know that I would have been so willing to go back to 12-step meetings myself when, what hit the fan years down the line.
Yeah. So how are things now today? I mean, is there anything else that you wanted to share before we kind of get to present day, or?
Yeah. I ended up finishing college. I got a teaching job in Hawaii. I had stopped going to meetings for months by the time I made it to Hawaii. I relapsed. I smoked weed, and a lot of weed, in Hawaii, like most people do who live in Hawaii, for 2 years straight. I lost my job. I lost all my savings. I stole from people. I borrowed money that I couldn't pay back. And it was like, I might as well have been doing hard drugs and drinking again. I convinced my parents that I was simply a poor manager of my finances, and they flew me back to the States. I went to St. Augustine. This is where I made it to St. Augustine, because they had purchased a house to be closer to my grandparents. They weren't moving in yet, and they thought it'd be a great idea for me to, be the safekeeper of their new retirement home. Well, it turns out that was where the last year of my addiction really unfolded, and I found myself in the darkest place I ever have in the 10 or so years of my addiction. And after a series of really unfortunate events, no more legal intervention, just poor mental health and decision making, had my first, what I would call, moment of clarity with my spirituality, where I asked God for help one night, lying on the front lawn smoking a cigarette. And it was not a pleasant request. It was like, laden with curse words, and it was not a prayer that you would want to say out loud in church. And from that day on, I have been sober. I picked up the phone. I was compelled to ask for help and to just spill the beans to my family. And I have been sober ever since. I did go to treatment for 30 days. And then I went to sober living in St. Paul. I went to the Twin Cities and got sober. And that's where I spent my first year of sobriety. And it was one of the more magical years of my life, that first year of sobriety. And, lots of really cool spiritual moments with, some hard work and fending for myself and paying for myself and buying my own crappy car and learning how to set boundaries with people and communicate and feel uncomfortable. And that was where I laid my foundation for my recovery. And 10 years later, it's still something that I incorporate into my everyday life as best as I can with a 3-year-old and a 10-month-old.
That's awesome. So, what do you think made you hit sort of that emotional rock bottom? When you were laying on the ground, swearing expletives at God to help you. What was this sort of like this final straw, do you think?
I had always been somebody that liked uppers, amphetamines, cocaine, and I had started smoking them, and it just had a more profound effect on me the next day as far as like how crappy I felt. The depressive state that followed, after using drugs in that way was just really had kind of a stranglehold on me. And I was drinking and driving again a lot, and I was blacking out again a lot. And I was spending time with people who were really scaring the crap out of me, who were really, really scaring me. And we were going to places that were really, I was not comfortable with, and I was witnessing things that I wasn't comfortable with, and participating things in that I wasn't comfortable with. And I was stealing. I was a thief of opportunity, a cowardly thief of opportunity. And I just that night realized that I had gone so far from the vision that God and that my parents had hoped that I would become. I was just overcome with, I can't do this. This is not what life is about. There's no way that this is what life is about. And I'm 26 years old, and I can't keep going like this. I, had stacks of mail in the house that I hadn't opened, and my credit was horrible, and I had a college degree with nothing to show for, and a part-time job that had nothing to do with it. And I just was tired of being tired, as they say in the 12-step rooms.
Yeah. So you asked for help from God, and then is that when you went to St. Paul?
Yeah. The next day I picked up the phone. I told my family what I had been doing. And of course, at this point they knew. And they flew me back to Pennsylvania, where I stayed for a few days. And then I flew to Minneapolis, and a nice old man picked me up in a white van. And in the airport, I bought the biggest bag of Starburst that I could find. And I munched on Starburst the whole way to Hazelden, which is where I went to treatment in Center City, which is in northern Minnesota. And I got sober there, and I had a really, really good experience. And I had been to IOP previously at a small rehab in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The second time I got a DUI, the first time I really kind of took a solid shot at getting sober. And when I relapsed, I remember thinking, oh my God, everything those people were saying, everything the people that, the peers and the employees of this place were telling me was true. I relapsed, and everything, the whole, like, the disease is in the parking lot doing pushups while you're in here getting sober. All that stuff was true. And so when I went to Hazelden, I had this really great attitude that I wasn't, going to let anything get in the way of my sobriety. And I was so desperate to get away from the life that I had created for myself that I kind of, like, with clenched teeth, shaking my head yes to everything anyone was suggesting, internally going, I don't think, still my default, addict thinking was like, I don't think that this is a good idea. I don't want to do this. Sober living, absolutely not. Extension, absolutely not. Meetings, absolutely not. But outwardly just shaking my head yes, like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. And yeah, I lived in St. Paul for a year in sober living, and laid down the foundations of my early recovery.
Chris, you mentioned a couple times now having like these spiritual moments. I was wondering if maybe you could share one of those and how it relates to your recovery.
Yeah. I wrote a little blog for our website a couple of years ago called Taking the Long Way Home. And that's kind of how I'd like to describe what I feel like is my first real serious spiritual experience. I was a key holding supervisor at Jamba Juice, which is like a
Hmm.
smoothie company, franchise smoothie company. And it was across town. And I lived on the other side of town. I was living in St. Paul. And for those who don't know, the Twin Cities are about 10 or 20 miles apart. And St. Paul's on one side and Minneapolis is on the other. And I was living on one side of St. Paul, riding the bus to Jamba Juice. And it really was only like a 15 or 20-minute drive by car, but by bus, it was like well over an hour because of all the stops you make and the kind of weird routes that they take to get there. And I got tired and I was there in November and it was freezing up there and very windy. It's really windy up there. And I got tired of waiting for the bus. And oftentimes I'd be getting out of IOP, intensive outpatient, so late at night because I was doing the night track so I could do it after work, that the last bus line, I'd either miss it or it'd be too dark and it'd be like snowing and it would just blow by me and not even see me. And so
wow.
I started walking home and I started walking everywhere. And I started listening to new music and taking pictures. It was like the first phone I had where I could like take, decent pictures. And I would put headphones in and I would leave the sober house at like 4 a.m. and I would walk across town in the dark. And I used to tell people it was 20 miles, 20, 30 miles. And one friend of mine in recovery was like, why don't you actually look up how far it is? Because something tells me that you're exaggerating. It was
Too funny.
5.9 miles. So, it's a good walk,
It's a decent walk.
Yeah. But I had these moments where, sometimes I would just be crying or I would like be observing people laughing or, feeling the snow hit my face and, oftentimes finding myself with like tears in the corner of my eyes and taking pictures and appreciating, the scenery. And it was those walks where my spirit was becoming alive again. And I was finding, love for music again and for taking pictures and expressing myself creatively. And I started getting in shape too. So I started walking essentially, 12 miles every day. And then I started running. And so I found another kind of spiritual moment in these runs that I would take all over St. Paul, which is a very kind of urban, even the greater St. Paul area is very urban and there's bridges everywhere and you can really walk and ride a bike or run, as far as you want. And I fell in love with the city and I fell in love with myself again and taking care of myself. And these walks, taking the long way home, it just kind of was the defining moment in my early sobriety where I have not thought about drinking or drugging since I had one using dream the first night I was in Hazelden. And from that moment on, I've never thought about drinking or drugging again. And I certainly attribute my kind of newfound love and respect for the beautifulness of life, during those walks to that relief.
Wow. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'll look forward to taking the long way home and I'll add it to the show notes for people to read.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. So in these long walks, these 20, 30-mile walks, as you put it to your friends, you were finding these spiritual moments. And it sounds like you were just really mindful of just like finding beauty everywhere. It sounds like.
No, that's exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
I did end up buying a car, a 1996 Toyota 4Runner with the wheel wells rusted out. So it looked like a big monster truck, but I still walked everywhere, even with the car. The car was more for meetings and I did start taking it to work, but I still walked everywhere. Yeah, it was a special year for me.
That's amazing. So Chris, as we kind of run out of time here, getting close to the end, yeah. I'm wondering what parts of yourself maybe are different now than back then, and maybe what things have you sort of held on to that have really been helpful in your recovery?
Man, what a great question. I think there's this gift that we're given in sobriety that your quote unquote normie or someone who's never had a problem with addiction that isn't offered the gift of recovery and the tools that come with it. this self-reflective nature that people have in recovery, where we can take pause and backtrack if we're being a jerk, or think about it that night and figure out how we're going to make things right with that person the next day, or kind of wipe the slate clean each morning and try to be a better version of ourselves than we were the day before. That's something that I've really tried to hang on to in recovery. And I still have a sponsor. I'm currently going to 2 meetings a week, a virtual meeting and an in-person meeting, which is kind of all I can muster with a young family. I do have a sponsee who I learn more from him than he probably learns from me at this point. And I think what's changed in me is, I guess I was probably more teachable in the early years of my recovery. And that's something that, I'm not super proud to say. I do need to really try hard to be, I was really self-conscious in my addiction, and I found my voice in recovery. And now the problem I have today is harboring my ego and pride, So I think I've become more confident, and I've become more, almost too confident. I have to kind of restrict my pride and check it as often as I can. And I do that with my sponsor, and luckily all my coworkers in recovery. And, my wife certainly has no problem keeping me in line. But yeah, I guess I always want to try to remain teachable, however hard that might be. I think as you gain more years of sobriety, you become more confident, and that could be a harder thing for people to hang on to, is remaining teachable.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. I love that. All right, Chris. Well, thanks. Thank you so much for being on.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit now about how people can find you, maybe share with us some links to how people can see the awesome work that you're doing at Augustine Recovery, and stop by and say hi.
Absolutely. I am the director of admissions at Augustine Recovery. We're a family-owned and operated long-term residential program for people suffering with addiction and trauma. The website is augustinerecovery.com. You can find us on Facebook. I believe it's facebook.com/Augustine Recovery. And our Instagram handle is also Augustine Recovery. And, you can email me, chris@augustinerecovery.com, if you'd like to learn more about our small, funky, family-owned and operated program.
Yeah. All right. Well, that sounds great. Okay, Chris, thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Adina.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.